The World Bank says Africa's average annual enrollment growth rate in its higher education institutions is at 15%. According to the World Bank also, higher education sector averages 1/5 of total educational expenditure, which in turn accounts for 1/5 of all central government expenditures. Professor Anthony Jarvis, the new provost of Lancaster University Ghana, now joins me to discuss the challenges of delivering quality higher education in Africa. Welcome to the show, Professor Jarvis.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
So let's start first with, as Lancaster Ghana's new provost, talk us through your plans and strategies going forward.
Well, I've taken over a going concern which has gone from nothing to nearly 600 students in 4 years. So it's been very, very rapid growth, and Lancaster University Ghana has quickly established itself as one of the premier private institutions in Ghana. It has a good number of course offerings at the moment across ranging from accounting and finance, business, law, international relations, economics, through to postgraduate courses in management, the executive EMBA, which is a triple accredited postgraduate qualification. The challenge for me is to expand the available offerings and also to make it clear. One of the concerns, I think, not just for Ghana but for Africa generally, there's a great exodus from sub-Saharan Africa to the university sectors in the UK, to Australia to some extent, and the United States.
And why is that so? Because for now, it's obviously an established fact that Africans excel better at their academics outside the shores of the continent than they do when you compare to how they function within the educational system within Africa.
It's a really good question, Christine. It goes right to the heart of the matter. Building a university sector, a tertiary sector of quality, takes a great deal of time and a great deal of money. It doesn't appear overnight. So, for example, if we look at the Chinese tertiary sector, vast amounts of money invested, but the growth in quality research and quality teaching has taken decades to build. It's a long, slow, purposeful process, and it takes a great deal of investment and effort. And in some ways, one of the problems in sub-Saharan Africa is, despite some excellent research and some excellent universities, the quality of tertiary institutions in sub-Saharan Africa is highly varied. So you have a sort of perfect storm in Africa. On one side, you have this rapidly expanding population, and I think it's a common enough figure that at current estimates, around half of the African population is 15 or under. So there's tremendous pressure on educational institutions, which are by and large under-resourced. So you have huge pressure on the secondary sector, you have huge pressure on the tertiary sector. So there are some excellent students who simply can't get into the best universities of their choice. So if they have enough resources, enough family commitment, they will look for alternatives elsewhere, and that means
a way out.
A way out, because the issue is, of course, that nobody works just in one place anymore. And if you're a young, ambitious African, you have global ambitions. You are likely to work somewhere else in the world other than Africa in your lifetime. Africa will be the place to be in the next 2 or 3 decades. It has tremendous growth potential, and it's an extraordinary place with extraordinary talent.
Professor Jarvis, are you at this point able to talk us through your expansion plans?
Yes, so my plan for Lancaster in particular is to build a quality university in Ghana. So in fact, the plan is to deliver a full suite of programs, to expand into things like engineering, more extensive postgraduate qualifications in law, in science, in some of the vocational fields. The plan really is to make sure there's a world quality institution available in Ghana, so Africans don't have to leave Africa to get a qualification that gives them a pathway to the world, pathway to Africa, and a gateway to the world if they want.
Let's talk partnerships. Are you able to speak to the partnerships that may be in the works or that already exist between Lancaster and other organizations for now?
There are two sets of partnerships that are important or three really, in Lancaster. The first is the originating partnership. Lancaster University Ghana has come about through a very fruitful relationship between the transnational academic group based in Dubai and Lancaster University in Lancaster, UK. So transnational academic group is extraordinary in many ways. It has this very, very long-term commitment, and TAG's byline is the company that develops the people who develop the nations. And that's exactly what it does. It's made an extensive and long-term investment in sub-Saharan Africa and initially in Ghana, and has partnered with a top 10 British university. Lancaster University is now ranked 6th in the UK, which is an extraordinary thing for a university that's only 50 years old. So the founding partnership is one between a private educational institution and a public university, which has given rise to Lancaster University Ghana. The second set of partnerships are between Lancaster University Ghana as an entity and corporate Ghana and corporate West Africa. So one of the things that Lancaster University Ghana is very, very committed to is building partnerships with industry for students before students leave university. So that means strong relationships with all of the critical firms in Ghana. So that's the second set of partnerships. The third set of partnerships that are important for LU Ghana is the relationship with secondary schools. So we try and encourage and develop and build those relationships and help where we can develop the quality of secondary education.
Now, having operated within the academic sector, within the sub-Saharan African environment over the past 4 years now as Lancaster University, what major challenges do you see?
I'd say the major challenge continues to be getting enough students who've had a sufficiently strong secondary education. The weakness for much of the tertiary sector, and a big challenge for Lancaster University Ghana, is the quality of students coming into the process. So we have a foundation year which transitions students from the Ghanaian secondary school system into the British system of the Lancaster University degree. But it's a tremendous challenge. It's in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, it's an under-resourced sector. There's a lack of training for many teachers. It's not for want of effort, but want of training and resources. That's one of our biggest challenges.
Now, you made reference earlier to students with the wherewithal and the means and the resources being able to get out of the continent where education is more easily accessible. Now, for those who do not have those resources, we've noticed the rise in the trend of distance learning and online courses. What's your assessment of these programs in terms of contributing to the ease of access and quality of education?
I think they're very important, and increasingly they'll become significant components. My view, however, is, and I've worked in this sector for a very long time, and I've been part of that revolution in technology and blended methods of delivery, and I'm a firm believer in it. I'm, however, a firm believer in the campus experience, that part of the importance of a university education, particularly for an undergraduate degree, is the campus experience, building networks and the face-to-face interaction with skilled professionals. Much of that has to come first. The purpose of an undergraduate degree is to learn how to learn. And you can incorporate, particularly in second and third years, some of the blended modes of delivery. I think blended delivery is more appropriate as a model for postgraduate education, where somebody has already had the experience of learning how to learn. It has a small place in undergraduate education, but will primarily find its footing and leverage in postgraduate education.
Now, private higher education is one of the fastest growing areas of education in Africa. In 2009, there were around 468 private higher education institutions on the African continent. Between now and then, we've seen more rise. In your opinion, what factors would you say have led to the surge in private higher education on the continent?
Again, we go back to the question of demand. there is almost an endless demand for higher education in Africa, and a very, very limited pool of resources across most countries to provide it. So governments are increasingly faced with increasing demand for tertiary education, and given all the other elements of an infrastructure that they struggle with, primary and secondary education, for example, the Ghana has just introduced a scheme to fully pay for secondary education. That requires a substantial investment in resources, but it will also mean after 2020 there will be a flood of new students into the tertiary sector, and very little provision has been made for them, and there's very little likelihood that the resources will be found easily to provide places for those students. So that means you need innovative approaches to funding tertiary infrastructure, and that increasingly means partnerships such as the one between TAG and Lancaster University.
Professor, are you able to at this point make a case for privately funded versus, say, government-funded higher institutions? Which would you say has more advantage and why? More importantly, to what extent would you say either is pivotal to the success of the student or the education sector in Africa?
I will sit on that fence. And it's an uncomfortable position, but I'm there. Now, in fact, you know, and it feels like a politician's answer, for which I apologise. Both are important. Both are important, one, because that you need a strong, vibrant public sector, because it will help students who will, even under the best circumstances, not find their way into a private sector university because of the expense. Also because a great deal of excellent research is done in public universities, and they're integral to the national life of any country. Developing, it makes no difference. A vibrant research sector in public universities and public institutions is critical. That said, private universities can make a tremendous contribution, both in terms of research. So, for example, Lancaster University Ghana, in partnership with Lancaster University, University of Benin in Nigeria, the CSIR in Ghana has, at Lancaster University in the UK, built a research partnership around the Global Challenges Research Fund administered by the UK government around health and sanitation and clean water. So it's an interesting building an interesting research relationship which has a important practical impact in all across West Africa. So those partnerships are important. And just in terms of capacity, you know, Africa will increasingly have to rely on a private sector. That raises a question of cost.
True. Lancaster
University Ghana ploughs back millions of dollars into scholarships and sponsorships for students. So it may be seen as private, but there's also a commitment to access for students who normally would not be able to move into that sector. So a sector that is committed to diversity and inclusion in the private sector can complement a struggling public university sector and build strong relationships with them.
So whether privately funded or government funded, you're all for building strong partnerships?
Strong partnerships and also inclusion. So one of the things that Lancaster University Ghana, and particularly driven by TAG, has been a commitment to find ways to bring in students who could normally not afford to access that sort of education.
Okay, Professor, I'll hold you on to that thought. Professor Anthony Jarvis is the new Provost of Lancaster University Ghana. As we continue our discussion on the challenges of delivering quality higher education in sub-Saharan Africa, still with me is Professor Anthony Jarvis, the new Provost of Lancaster University Ghana. Professor, thank you for your time on the show. So I'm looking at some of these figures about education in Africa facts. It says Africa has the highest rates of educational exclusion in the world. Over 1/5 of children between the ages of 6 and 11 and 1/3 between the ages of 12 and 14 are out of school. It talks about a UNESCO study in 2012 which showed that the number of primary-aged children are not attending schools in Africa, and they account for more than half of the global total. You've been around for a significant number of years. What's your perception of higher education in Africa? from your experience?
It's an issue where the lack of capacity is enormous, and the figures you just mentioned about in a sense, the failure to bring everybody along in private and secondary education is troubling, to say the least. Africa will need all the talent it can muster over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. There's tremendous work to be done, and much of it will need to be done by the tertiary sector to build leaders who are interested in developing Africa. So one of the things that I found attractive about Lancaster University in Ghana is that it brings to Africa a world-class degree. So when students come to Lancaster University in Ghana, they're actually getting exactly the same degree as offered by Lancaster University in the UK. So it's exactly the same degree.
So they don't have to go that far to get the quality of education.
They don't have to go far. So the thing is that what you would ideally hope the sector does is not only train Africans to be global citizens, to be able to work anywhere in the world, but also to instill in them the desire and awareness that they can work well and flourish in Africa as well. So in a sense, to do their undergraduate education in Africa, I think, is the ultimate goal.
Professor, allocations to education funding from within budgets across Africa still leaves much to be said. It does not even come close to the UNESCO quota. If you were to propose solutions to tackling educational deficiencies within sub-Saharan Africa, what specific strategies would you propose in the immediate term? In the immediate term,
it has to be looking at the private sector, finding ways of funding education. It's hard to say to a government who has so many competing responsibilities: infrastructure, health, just providing electricity. You know, in Nigeria and Ghana, women die in childbirth because clinics in rural regions don't have electricity at night. So these are tragedies that need to be overcome quickly and require, massive investment on all fronts. But it's also true that higher education requires massive investment, that in order to build and develop the people who will lead Africa, the higher education sector needs to be developed. So I'm avoiding your question is, how do we find the resources? It's in
the immediate term.
In the immediate term is to find innovative partnerships, public-private partnerships where there is investment. What Africa can do about that is improve governance. In the immediate term, you can make it easier for private institutions to work within Africa. One of the things that's particularly difficult in Nigeria and Ghana and Uganda and Kenya is the regulatory environment for private institutions to come in is incredibly difficult to navigate. Loosening some of the regulatory inhibitions would make a huge difference very, very quickly.
And to what extent would you say that politics interferes with the mix?
Wow, that's a big question, and a dangerous question. There's a dangerous question anywhere, but I suspect even more dangerous in Africa. Politics can be extraordinarily short-sighted. I'm originally a professor of political science and international relations. So
the question is not as dangerous.
No, I know that it's really dangerous. One of the problems for any government is the length of time it takes to effect change is nearly always considerably more than an electoral cycle. That in a sense a long-term vision needs to be put in place with commitment from all political parties and all those interested in the process. The difficulty in Africa is maintaining stable and committed government, being committed to the project of improving education and improving infrastructure across a 2 or 3 decade experience. You need that vision and drive and commitment from everybody in government, no matter what party they are, to provide ethical leadership and stable government.
Recently in Nigeria's north, Kaduna specifically, the state government decided to move away from the traditional approach of testing students to let's check the teachers and see what's wrong with the education system, and the results were abysmal at best. Led to the state government sacking 21,780 teachers out of the 33,000 teachers who wrote the test rather. So leads to the question, how do we fix the mess in the education sector if the teachers themselves need to be taught?
I remember when that result came out, that was like an earthquake. You could feel the tremors all through Africa. It was an extraordinary result, but also an instructive one. Instructive for a number of reasons. So the question is, how do you end up with 21,000 teachers who are manifestly unsuited to the profession in which they find themselves in? The question arises as to training. The question also arises as to how are these teachers certified in the first place? How do you end up as a government employee in a job where you are manifestly unsuited, unqualified, and possibly don't have the talent or interest in doing? One is it provides a form of employment. It goes back to the importance of a tertiary sector, training high quality teachers, providing funding for those teachers, paying them well. It's important to understand, I'm not being directly critical of those 21,000, and they ended up in those positions for a number of different reasons. Secondary teaching and primary teaching is one of the hardest professions in the world. It is incredibly effortful and difficult. It takes huge amounts of skill and commitment to do it. I remember watching my daughter when she started primary school, and I remember I'd been teaching undergraduates for a long time by then, and I remember watching my daughter at primary school and watching her primary school teacher, and I remember thinking, I have never worked that hard in my life with a group of young students. And a good teacher can make a tremendous difference to a school, but they need training, and they need to be paid well. It's the most important sector, and any government needs to put appropriate resources in.
Professor, how can Africa begin to prioritise education? It will be a journey, no doubt.
It will be a journey, but it's also understanding, I think in much the same way, it's a very good question. And there are lessons from other countries. In Mexico in the 1950s, a group of businessmen got together and thought through, what does Mexico need in order to develop? And they identified the lack of tertiary educated Mexicans as a significant impediment to development. And you can see that in Africa. Africa should not be importing the vast amount of expatriate labour that it does.
Especially when you consider the fact that skilled people and expatriates here are jetting out for opportunities.
That's right. There are enough talented Africans to build and work in Africa. So the question is why does it happen? There are possibly not as many as you would need, but the question is, why isn't Africa producing its own? With the quantities and motivations and the opportunities for those people in Africa. Again, the Mexican case is interesting. Those businessmen got together and founded a group called the Tec de Monterrey, who built, I think to date, about 32 or 33 campuses across Mexico, dedicated to developing Mexicans for the Mexican economy and Mexican society. They also, interestingly, discovered that one of their biggest problems was the lack of qualified students coming to university, so they attached to every university they built a secondary school. So not only did they provide a university sector, they provided a secondary school sector as well. They grew their own students, as it were, to move in, and they operate very closely with the public university sector in Mexico, which is very good, but again, like Africa, suffers from limited resources.
So we do need to revisit the models of institutions and education that we have in sub-Saharan Africa.
Urgently.
Thank you very much for your time on the show. I have been speaking to Professor Anthony Jarvis, the Provost of Lancaster University Ghana.